Hello, boys and girls. I'm so excited to be here with you on this Easter morning. This month, we're talking about peace. Peace is proving you care more about each other than winning an argument. When you make peace with someone, you reconnect with them. You build a bridge and get over your differences. And speaking of bridges, we're going to look at some real-life bridges real quick. This first one is a picture of the Pearl Bridge in Japan. It is the longest suspension bridge in the world. And you might recognize this next one. It's the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And am I the only one thinking that with a name like that, you'd expect it to not be red? Okay, this next one is in London. It's not the London Bridge, but it is a London Bridge, known as the Tower Bridge. So what do all these bridges have in common? They connect one side to the other. They span over the gap that separates the two sides. And I know it's odd to talk about bridges on Easter, but bridges on Easter they do have more in common than you might think. So in order to find out why, we're going to go all the way back to the beginning of the Bible. Okay? And I'm going to show you some pictures as I tell the story. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God made a magnificent paradise full of diversity and with all kinds of plants, trees, waterfalls, birds, fish, flowers, and animals. And then God created people in his image and breathed life into them. God was close to Adam and Eve. They went on walks together and talked together. God made them partners in caring for the good creation he had made. It was good times in the Garden of Eden. But then things took a bad turn. See, God gave Adam and Eve a boundary in the garden, something that was off limits to them, to remind them that God was in charge. And God told them, don't eat from this one tree. You can eat from every other tree, but if you eat from this tree, you will certainly die. Now you would think one tree of many would be easy to avoid, but Adam and Eve were tempted, and they broke the boundary God had given them. They ate from the tree that was off limits. And in that moment, everything changed. The peace of the garden was gone. The wonderful beginning God created became broken. Sin had entered the story, and it created a gap between people and God, a gap that was going to grow. People began to lie and blame one another. Later on, brother turned against brother, and selfishness, greed, and violence grew among people. They chose to ignore God and began to worship false gods. It was a time of chaos, and it was breaking God's heart. The distance between God and his people was getting bigger. How would this gap ever be bridged? Well, God wasn't done. God chose a man named Abraham and made a big promise to him. God told Abraham that all the nations on earth would be blessed because of him. God told Abraham that one day his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on would outnumber the stars in the sky. And God kept his promise and gave Abraham a huge family that grew into the nation of Israel. But there was still a distance between people and God. Eventually, God's people became enslaved in Egypt under the ruthless rule of Pharaoh. But God was with them still, and through Moses, he miraculously led them out of Egypt. And now they were in the desert, on the way to the promised land. And even after being rescued miraculously, it was hard for the people to see what God was doing and how God was caring for them. They grumbled and they complained. And after making it to the promised land, the Israelites still struggled to obey God and serve him only. They asked God for a king to rule over them, and God gave them kings like King David. And some of the kings followed God and some didn't. Kings often led people astray, even leading them to follow the gods of other nations. God's people kept disobeying God. It's like they were saying, anything and anyone but you, God. God warned them and gave them all kinds of chances, but still they wouldn't listen. And then enemy nations attacked them and took them away into captivity. But you know what? God hadn't forgotten his promise to Abraham that all nations would be blessed because of him. And when the time was right, God made a way to rescue his people. He sent his one and only son, Jesus, to bring peace once and for all to the world. And Jesus lived a perfect life. He taught people about love, caring for others, forgiveness, and making things right. He healed sick people and he loved others in a way that amazed everyone. But there was a really sad part of God's plan that had to happen next. Jesus died on a cross. Jesus gave his life for us. And what happened next after he died and was buried is why we celebrate Easter. It all has to do with the empty tomb. That's right. When Jesus' friends went to the tomb to pay their respects, it was empty. Let's read part of what happened, okay, in the Gospel of John. But Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she cried, she bent over to look into the tomb. She saw two angels dressed in white. They were seated where Jesus' body had been. One of them was where Jesus' head had been laid. The other sat where his feet had been placed. And they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken away my Lord," she cried. "I don't know where they have put him." Then she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But she didn't realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" She thought it was a gardener. So she said, "Sir, did you carry him away? Tell me where you put him. Then I will go and get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him. Then she cried out in the Aramaic language, "Rabbi," which means teacher. That comes from John 20:11-16. When he said Mary, she knew it was Jesus. She was surprised, and why wouldn't she be? She saw him die. She came to the grave to find him. But you know what? He was alive then, and he is alive now. Jesus is more powerful than death. He's more powerful than sin. The sin that caused a divide between people and God, Jesus is more powerful than that. And that's how a bridge and Easter have something in common. A bridge connects two sides. Well, Jesus made a new way for people to be close to God. And he forever healed the brokenness caused by sin. That is what Easter is all about. Boys and girls, there are some fun activities in your boxes. You should have gotten them this week. And if you haven't opened them yet, be sure to do so today because there might be some Easter goodies in there for you. I hope you have a wonderful Easter.